My son was about to host a dinner to announce my obsolescence. He had no idea I had already signed the papers that made his entire future obsolete. The phone call came on a Tuesday, the air thick with the scent of rain and freshly cut grass from my neighbor's yard. It was Mark, my only son, his voice imbued with a false heartiness that always set my teeth on edge. He never called just to chat. There was always a purpose, a prelude to a request, that would invariably leave my accounts a little lighter and my spirit a little heavier. For years, I had been the silent, ever-reliable bank, the financial bedrock upon which he and his wife, Sarah, had built their ostentatiously comfortable lives. A life I, in my quiet, modest home, had funded, but was rarely invited to truly share. Their gratitude was a fleeting currency, spent the moment a transaction cleared. This time, however, he wasn't asking for money, not directly. He was extending an invitation, a summons disguised as a family gesture. "Mom, we're having a special family dinner this Saturday," he'd said, the words carefully chosen. "There's something important Sarah and I need to announce, and we want everyone to be there." An announcement. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken implications. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach, a familiar dread that had become my constant companion in recent years. It wasn't the kind of excitement that precedes good news. It was the chilling premonition of a carefully orchestrated move on a chessboard, where I was once again intended to be a pawn. I had seen the signs, of course, for years. The way their eyes would glaze over when I spoke of my own needs, the subtle eye rolls exchanged when I'd mentioned the rising cost of my property taxes, the casual way they'd present their latest financial crisis, a new car lease for Sarah, because her current luxury SUV was starting to feel dated, or the urgent need for a 5-figure contribution to a summer camp for their youngest, that specialized in something preposterously niche, like equestrian robotics. I had always paid. I had paid for the down payment on their sprawling house in that gated community, the one with the ludicrously high homeowner association fees. I had covered the exorbitant tuition for my grandchildren's private schools, a decision they'd made without ever consulting me, simply assuming I would provide. I had even, to my eternal shame, paid off Mark's substantial credit card debt, a consequence of a failed business venture that seemed, in retrospect, more like a prolonged and expensive hobby. My life had become a series of automatic transfers and resigned sighs. I lived comfortably. It was true, my late husband, David, had been a prudent man, but my comfort was a stagnant pool, its resources slowly but surely being siphoned away to water the lush, manicured lawn of my son's ambition. They saw my savings not as my security, my freedom, my final chapter's peace, but as their inheritance, just one they had decided to receive in convenient, regular installments, before I was even gone. The constant financial drain was more than just a depletion of funds, it was an erosion of my self-worth. Each request, each assumption of my compliance, was a small death to my own autonomy. They saw me not as Eleanor, the woman who had raised them, who had passions and dreams of her own, but as a utility, a resource to be managed and exploited until it ran dry. I often found myself sitting in my favorite armchair, the one David and I had picked out together, and just staring at the wall, tracing the slow, creeping shadow of my own irrelevance. This dinner, this important announcement, felt different, though. It felt like a culmination, a final, decisive act in their long campaign of emotional and financial attrition. Perhaps they were announcing a move, one that would require a substantial investment from me to secure a property in a more prestigious neighborhood. Or perhaps it was something more personal, something designed to formally shift the power dynamic, to place me firmly in the category of dependent elder, even as I was the one keeping their entire glittering facade from collapsing. A deep, instinctual part of me, the part that had been silenced for too long, knew this was a turning point. It was a premonition so strong, so chillingly certain, that it jolted me out of my passive melancholy. The casual dismissal in Mark's tone, the way he spoke of the announcement as a mere formality, as if my reaction was irrelevant, was the final sharp splinter under the nail. It was the insult that finally outweighed years of injury, and in that moment, listening to his cheerful sign-off, a seed of profound resentment, long dormant, finally broke through the soil of my acquiescence. It began to grow, not into a weed of helpless anger, but into the strong, unyielding trunk of a towering oak. He thought he was setting the stage for his next move. He had absolutely no idea that I was about to rewrite the entire play. The week before that fateful dinner invitation was the most transformative of my life. It began with a simple mundane event, a bank statement. I had it open on my kitchen table, the morning sun illuminating a column of figures that told a story of quiet hemorrhage. There it was in black and white, the monthly mortgage payment for Mark and Sarah's house, an automatic debit I had authorized years ago in a moment of maternal weakness. Next to it was the payment for Sarah's car lease, another $500 vanishing from my account like clockwork. Then there were the smaller, more insidious transfers, the ones labeled school fees and family support, vague terms for the constant stream of cash that flowed in one direction only from me to them. For years I had looked at these statements with a sense of resignation, a sad acceptance of my role, but on this particular morning, staring at the numbers, something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift, a profound and irreversible internal realignment. The figures no longer represented love or duty, they represented exploitation. My mind, suddenly sharp and clear, began to work like an accountant's ledger. I didn't just see the numbers, I saw the memories attached to them, each one a small betrayal. I remembered Mark's 30th birthday, when he'd lamented his inability to afford a proper family vacation. I had written a check for $10,000, imagining my grandchildren's delighted faces at Disney World. I later saw the photos on social media, Mark and Sarah at a 5-star resort in Bali, no children in sight. I recalled the time Sarah had tearfully explained that little Chloe, my granddaughter, was being held back in her public school. The solution, naturally, was an exclusive private academy with a yearly tuition that rivaled a college education. I agreed, wanting the best for Chloe, only to overhear Sarah telling a friend on the phone that the real reason for the switch was the superior networking opportunities with other wealthy parents. The list went on, a long, painful litany of my generosity being twisted into a tool for their social climbing and selfish desires. Each memory was a fresh cut, and the accumulated pain was staggering. This was my aha moment. It arrived not with a bolt of lightning, but with the cold, hard clarity of a winter dawn. My financial support had not fostered love, gratitude, or even basic respect. It had cultivated the very worst in my son and his wife, a deep, corrosive entitlement. They didn't see my sacrifices. They saw an obligation. My generosity was not a gift. It was their due. I realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that I was not helping them. I was enabling them, crippling them with a dependence that had stunted their empathy and their character. By continuing to be their safety net, I was ensuring they would never learn to stand on their own. I was not building a legacy of family love. I was underwriting a dynasty of dysfunction. The dinner invitation, with its ominous promise of an announcement, was no longer a source of dread. It became a catalyst, a deadline. It was the universe telling me that the time for passive regret was over. The time for decisive action had arrived. The very next day, I made an appointment with Mr. Davies, the lawyer who had handled my husband's estate. His office was in an old, respectable brick building downtown, a place that smelled of aging paper and quiet competence. I walked in feeling a tremor of fear, the ingrained reluctance of a woman of my generation to cause a fuss, to rock the boat. But beneath the fear was a layer of something new, something hard and resolute. I sat across from his heavy mahogany desk, and in a voice that was surprisingly steady, I laid out the entire sordid history. I spared no detail, from the Bali vacation to the equestrian robotics camp. I explained the constant draining requests and the profound, soul-crushing lack of appreciation. Mr. Davies, a kind man with gentle eyes who had known me for 20 years, listened without interruption. He didn't show pity or shock, only a quiet, professional understanding. When I was finished, there was a long silence. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, "Eleanor, it seems to me you are not looking to make a small adjustment. You are looking to build a fortress." And in that moment, I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought me to tears. He understood. He truly understood. I gave him my instructions, clear and unequivocal. "I want a new will," I said, the words tasting of freedom. "One that reflects my current reality, not my past hopes." We spent the next 3 hours, meticulously dismantling the financial structure I had so foolishly built around my children. We drafted a new last will and testament, that left the bulk of my substantial estate not to Mark, but to a charitable foundation dedicated to education for underprivileged children, a cause my dear David had always championed. A modest, carefully defined trust fund was to be set up for my granddaughter Chloe, accessible only when she turned 25, ensuring she at least would have a chance at a future not dictated by her parents' greed. To Mark and Sarah, I left $1 each, a symbolic legal pittance to make it clear they were not forgotten, but deliberately and with full mental capacity, disinherited. But I knew a new will wasn't enough. They could contest it, or worse, try to have me declared incompetent. So we went further. Mr. Davies drew up the documents for an irrevocable trust. I would transfer the majority of my assets, my home, my investment portfolio, my savings, into this trust, with myself as the sole beneficiary and my steadfast friend, Brenda, as the trustee should I become incapacitated. The word irrevocable was key. Once signed, the assets in that trust would be legally untouchable, sealed away for my care and my peace of mind, completely beyond the reach of my son, the courts or any future claims he might dream up. The final step was to revoke, immediately and with prejudice, any and all powers of attorney I had ever granted Mark, and to put a stop payment order on every single automatic transfer that flowed from my accounts to his. I stressed to Mr. Davies the absolute necessity of secrecy. No one was to know until I chose to reveal it. He assured me of his complete discretion. I walked out of his office that afternoon into the bright sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in 30 years. The fortress was being built, the locks were being forged, and the key was mine and mine alone. The days between my meeting with Mr. Davies and the dreaded Saturday dinner were a study in contrasts. Outwardly, my life continued its placid rhythm. I tended to my garden, I spoke with my friend Brenda on the phone, I went for my gentle morning walks. But inwardly, a revolution was taking place. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been the soundtrack to my life for years had vanished, replaced by a profound and steady calm. It was the serenity that comes not from ignorance, but from control. I was no longer a passive spectator in my own life, waiting for the next financial blow to land. I was the architect of my own future, the quiet strategist moving my pieces into an unassailable position. There was a deep, almost serene satisfaction in this newfound power. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. I was reclaiming my peace, my assets, my very self from the people who had taken them for granted for so long. Mr. Davies worked with remarkable efficiency. A courier delivered a thick portfolio of documents to my door 2 days later. I spent an entire afternoon at my dining room table, the same table where I had signed so many checks for Mark and Sarah, and carefully reviewed each page. The legalese was dense, but the intent was crystal clear. The new will, with its $1 provision for my son. The deed of transfer, moving my beloved home into the protective custody of the irrevocable trust. The revocation of power of attorney, a document that felt as liberating as a declaration of independence. I signed each one with a firm, steady hand, the ink a dark, definitive line between my past of subservience and my future of sovereignty. I felt a quiet thrill, a sense of rightness so absolute, it was almost physical. This was not an act of anger, it was an act of profound self-love, a concept I was only just beginning to understand. That evening, to celebrate this silent, personal victory, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to the city and bought a single ticket to the symphony. I had always loved classical music, but it was an expense Sarah had once scoffed at. "Why would you spend that much on a ticket, Mom, when you can just listen on the radio?" she had said, just weeks before asking me for $3,000 for a new set of designer luggage. So I had stopped going, another small pleasure pruned from my life to make more room for their endless wants. But tonight I sat in the velvet seat, surrounded by the warmth of the concert hall, and let the soaring notes of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony wash over me. It was a hymn to joy, to freedom, to universal brotherhood, and it felt like the perfect score for my own quiet emancipation. I closed my eyes and felt a tear of pure, unadulterated happiness slide down my cheek. It was a happiness that belonged only to me. The inevitable phone call from Mark came on Friday morning, the day before the dinner. It was a perfunctory, almost dismissive check-in. "Hey Mom, Just wanted to make sure we're still on for tomorrow night. Around 7? He asked, his tone brisk and businesslike. There was no warmth, no genuine inquiry into my well-being. It was the call of a manager confirming an appointment with a subordinate. Yes, Mark, I'll be there, I replied, my voice even and calm. He couldn't detect the steel that now lined my spine, the fortress walls that had risen around my heart. He heard only what he expected to hear, the familiar, docile compliance of the woman he thought he had completely under his thumb. Great, he said, a note of finality in his voice. It's really important that you're there to hear our news. Oh, I'm sure it is, I thought to myself, a small, secret smile playing on my lips. The dramatic irony was almost too delicious to bear. He was so focused on his own little play, so confident in his role as the magnanimous son making a tough decision, that he was completely oblivious to the fact that the entire theater he was performing in had already been sold, and the new owner had just changed the locks. His impending announcement, which he imagined would be a bombshell, was now nothing more than a damp firecracker. Its power had been neutralized, its impact rendered utterly void, and the quiet satisfaction of that knowledge was the most exquisite pleasure I had felt in a very long time. I arrived at Mark and Sarah's house at precisely 7 o'clock, my old, reliable sedan feeling distinctly out of place among the gleaming German luxury cars that lined their curved driveway. The house itself was a monument to their aspirations, a sprawling two-story affair in a neighborhood where the lawns were unnaturally green and the silence was enforced by strict community bylaws. Every brick, every professionally landscaped flower bed was something I had helped pay for, a fact that used to fill me with a strange mixture of pride and resentment. Tonight, it filled me with nothing but a cool, detached sense of observation. It was no longer a part of me, it was merely an asset, one whose mortgage payments would soon be their problem, and their problem alone. Sarah opened the door, her smile a masterpiece of strained hospitality. She was dressed in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and her perfectly coiffed hair and flawless makeup gave her the look of a woman performing the role of a gracious hostess. "Eleanor, you made it. Come in, she chirped, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. The air inside was thick with a forced cheerfulness that did little to conceal the palpable tension humming just beneath the surface. It was the kind of atmosphere I had come to associate with their gatherings, a carefully curated display of success and happiness that always felt one minor inconvenience away from shattering. My granddaughter, Chloe, who was now a thoughtful teenager, was the first to greet me with genuine warmth. She gave me a tight hug. "Hi, Grandma. I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, her eyes holding a flicker of concern that told me she too sensed the artificiality of the evening. She was a good soul, a small island of sincerity in this sea of pretense, and the sole reason I had endured this family dynamic for as long as I had. I squeezed her hand, grateful for the connection. Mark was holding court by the oversized marble fireplace, a glass of expensive-looking scotch in his hand, laughing a little too heartily with Sarah's parents, who looked on with expressions of placid approval. He gave me a brief nod from across the room, a king acknowledging a courtier. The stage was set. The audience was assembled. All that was missing was the main event. We sat down to dinner at a long, polished mahogany table that was laden with food I knew for a fact Sarah had not cooked herself. The conversation was stilted, a series of bland pleasantries and thinly veiled boasts about their recent vacation, their children's achievements, their latest acquisitions. I remained mostly silent, a quiet observer at the feast of my own financial undoing. I ate my catered salmon, took small sips of my water, and felt an almost out-of-body sense of calm. The dread I had anticipated was completely absent. In its place was a quiet curiosity, the interest of a spectator waiting to see how the final act of a predictable play would unfold. I watched Mark as he orchestrated the evening, guiding the conversation, building the anticipation. He was enjoying this, the power of holding the room's attention, of being the bearer of important news. He was so caught up in his own self-importance that he was utterly blind. He saw me sitting there, quiet and unassuming in my simple cardigan, and saw the same old mom, the pushover, the open wallet. He had no earthly idea he was looking at a ghost, the ghost of the woman I used to be. Finally, after the dessert plates were cleared, Mark tapped his glass with a spoon, the crystal ringing out in the suddenly silent room. He stood up, placing a proprietary hand on Sarah's shoulder. He surveyed the table, his eyes lingering on me for a fraction of a second too long, a glint of what looked like pity in them. It was almost comical. He was about to deliver a blow he thought would wound me, a decision he had likely framed in his mind as a painful but necessary act of fiscal responsibility. He was preparing to orphan me from his future, from the imagined security of his own estate, a fantasy built entirely on the foundations of mine. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice resonating with practiced solemnity. "Sarah and I have been doing a lot of thinking lately about the future, about our financial independence and ensuring we build a secure legacy for our own children." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of his words settle. "We've had to make some difficult decisions, and one of them, I'm afraid, concerns you, Mom." He looked directly at me now, his expression a careful blend of resolve and regret. "As part of our new financial planning, we've decided that you're being cut from my will. It's a necessary, albeit difficult, step for our family's financial future." He then launched into a series of self-serving justifications, a well-rehearsed speech about my comfortable lifestyle, my supposed lack of need, and the importance of them standing on their own 2 feet, a phrase so breathtakingly ironic, it almost made me laugh out loud. My internal reaction was not the shock or despair he so clearly expected. It was a quiet, profound wave of bemused satisfaction. His timing, his utter, blissful ignorance, was more perfect than anything I could have ever planned. The trap he had intended for me had just snapped shut on himself. A thick, expectant silence fell over the dining room table. All eyes were on me. Sarah wore an expression of strained sympathy, her head tilted slightly as if comforting a bereaved friend. Mark stood there, puffed up with the gravity of his own announcement, waiting for my tears, my protests, my predictable emotional collapse. He had just delivered what he believed to be a stunning, life-altering blow, and he was ready to manage the fallout with condescending magnanimity. The quiet in the room was a vacuum, waiting to be filled with the drama he had so carefully engineered. I let the silence stretch for a moment longer, allowing the full weight of his pronouncement and its spectacular irrelevance to hang in the air. I took a deliberate sip of water, placed the glass down gently on the coaster, and met his gaze. There was no anger in my eyes, no hint of the devastation he anticipated. There was only a calm, unruffled serenity that seemed to utterly mystify him. "That's quite all right, Mark," I said, my voice perfectly even, carrying clearly in the quiet room. The simplicity of my response seemed to confuse everyone. It was not the reaction they had braced for. Mark's confident posture faltered for a fraction of a second. "Your will, or any provision within it," I continued, enunciating each word with gentle precision, "has no bearing whatsoever on my future." My words landed not with a crash, but with a quiet thud, their meaning not immediately registering. They were still operating within the framework of their own assumptions, their own narrative, where I was the needy, dependent one. I decided to provide a little clarity. I let a small, almost imperceptible smile touch my lips. "In fact," I added, my tone conversational, as if discussing the weather, "I've already taken comprehensive steps to secure my own, far more substantial future independently." The confusion on Mark's face began to curdle into disbelief. Sarah's mask of sympathy flickered, revealing a flash of genuine bewilderment underneath. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. They were trying to process my words, to fit them into their worldview, and finding that they simply wouldn't go. It was like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. My statement made no sense in the context of the woman they thought they knew. "So," I continued, my voice still calm, still devoid of any malice. "You see, I had a meeting with my lawyer last week, a very productive meeting." I let that sink in. The mention of a lawyer shifted the atmosphere in the room, from theatrical drama to something much more serious. "We've completely restructured my finances, my assets, my home, everything of value, has been placed into an irrevocable trust." I savored the word irrevocable, letting it echo in the silent space between us. "It's a wonderful legal instrument. It ensures that my money will be used exclusively for my care and my well-being for the rest of my life. It's designed, as Mr. Davies so aptly put it, to be a fortress." The penny finally began to drop. I could see the dawning horror in Mark's eyes as the true implications of my words started to pierce through his thick fog of arrogance. This wasn't about his will. It was about my will. It was about my money. As for my own will, I said, delivering the final quiet blow that has also been completely rewritten. I've made new arrangements that I am very, very happy with. I didn't need to spell it out for them. I didn't need to mention the single dollar I had so thoughtfully bequeathed them. The look on their faces told me they understood perfectly. The initial shock was now rapidly spiraling into wide-eyed, slack-jawed panic. The script had been flipped. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly and completely reversed. Sarah's face, which had been a carefully constructed mask of compassion, was now pale and blotchy, her mouth slightly agape. Mark looked as if he had been physically struck. The self-serving justifications, the condescending pity, the grand pronouncement, it all evaporated, revealing the raw, ugly greed that lay beneath. The full, devastating implications for them were finally crashing down, and the sound of their world shattering was, to me, the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. The elegant dining room, just moments before a stage for Mark's self-important drama, erupted into chaos. The stunned silence was shattered by Sarah's shriek, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. "What did you say?" she screeched, her voice cracking with disbelief as she shot to her feet, knocking her chair backward with a clatter. "What do you mean, an irrevocable trust?" Mark, snapping out of his stupor, pointed a trembling finger at me, his face a mask of crimson rage. "You can't do that," he sputtered, his voice rising to a shout. "That's our money. That's our children's inheritance. You have no right." The sudden, violent shift from feigned sympathy to raw, transactional fury was breathtaking. The thin veneer of family love and concern was stripped away in an instant, exposing the grasping, entitled core I had suspected was there all along. They weren't mourning the loss of a relationship. They were mourning the loss of their primary source of income. "You can't possibly do this to us," Sarah cried, her hands flying to her head in a gesture of theatrical despair. "It's illegal! We'll sue you! We'll have you declared incompetent." The threats came thick and fast, a frantic, desperate attempt to regain control, to bully me back into submission. Her parents, who had been sitting in stunned silence, began to murmur their agreement, casting me dark, accusatory glances. The accusation of madness, of incompetence, was their last, most desperate gambit. It was the ultimate insult, yet it washed over me, leaving me completely untouched. My fortress was already built, its walls sound and its gates locked. Their words were nothing more than angry winds rattling against impenetrable stone. I remained seated, a small island of calm in the swirling vortex of their hysteria. I looked from Sarah's contorted face to Mark's trembling rage, and I felt not fear, but a profound, almost clinical detachment. "Actually, Mark, I have every right," I said, my voice remaining level and firm, cutting through their frantic shouts like a surgeon's scalpel. "It was, and is, my money. Money earned by my husband and managed by me." I methodically began to dismantle their accusations, turning their own words back on them with devastating precision. "You talk about inheritance, but you seem to have treated it as an advance, one you've been drawing on for over 20 years. I started to list the specifics, my memory now a weaponized archive of their greed. "Let's talk about the $80,000 down payment for this very house. A gift, I believe you called it, or the $60,000 to pay off your business debts after your ventures in artisanal dog food went bankrupt." With each example, Mark flinched as if I had struck him. "Or perhaps we should discuss the lease on Sarah's brand new SUV every 2 years. Or the $30,000 kitchen renovation you insisted was essentials for the home's resale value." My words were not shouted. They were delivered with the cold, hard weight of truth. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned away, leaving behind the hard, clear diamond of certainty. "For years," I continued, my gaze unwavering, "I have funded your lifestyle. I have paid for your vacations, your cars, your children's schooling, your country club memberships, and in all that time I cannot recall a single genuine expression of gratitude." The accusation hung in the air, undeniable and damning. Instead, I have been met with endless demands, with thinly veiled contempt, and with the constant, unspoken assumption that my purpose was to serve as your personal bank. I turned my attention to Sarah, whose face was now pale with shock. "And as for my competence, Sarah, I assure you, I have never been more clear-headed in my life. The decision to protect myself from further financial and emotional exploitation was the sanest one I have ever made." The emotional pain in the room was now palpable, a thick, choking fog, But for the first time in decades, none of it was mine. It was theirs. A pain born not of love or loss, but of the sudden, brutal realization that the well had finally and irrevocably run dry. My unwavering composure in the face of their meltdown was the ultimate proof of my strength. I was no longer their victim. I was the architect of their consequences. Amidst the storm of her parents' fury, Chloe had remained silent. Her initial shock, a mirror of everyone else's, had slowly transformed into something else entirely. As Mark and Sarah's accusations grew more shrill and desperate, I saw a look of dawning comprehension, of profound and painful understanding, settle on her young face. She watched the ugly spectacle, not with the confusion of a child, but with the weary recognition of someone who had seen this behavior before, perhaps in smaller, more private moments. When Mark had bellowed that my actions were a betrayal, Chloe had visibly winced, her eyes darting towards me with an expression of deep, vicarious shame. She tried to interject once, a small, tentative, "Dad, stop," but her voice was immediately swallowed by the cacophony of her parents' rage. She was a silent witness, and in her silence I saw a flicker of hope, a sign that the poison of entitlement had not managed to corrupt every branch of the family tree. The dinner party ended abruptly. After I had calmly and methodically refuted every one of their claims, there was nothing left for them to do but vent their impotent rage. They ordered me out of their house, the house I had paid for, and I left without a backward glance, the sound of their bitter recriminations following me out the door. The drive home was quiet, the turmoil was behind me, and a deep, settled peace began to fill the void. The next afternoon, my phone rang. I saw Chloe's name on the screen and answered immediately. "Grandma?" Her voice was small, hesitant. "Are you okay?" The simple, genuine concern in her question was a balm to my soul, a stark contrast to the transactional nature of every conversation I'd had with her parents for years. "I'm more than okay, my dear," I told her, and for the first time it was the absolute truth. "I'm finally free." We talked for over an hour. She had called from the privacy of her bedroom, her voice hushed so her parents wouldn't overhear. She apologized for their behavior, her words laced with an embarrassment and maturity that was far beyond her years. "I was so horrified, Grandma. The things they said, the way they acted." She paused, and then confessed something that confirmed everything I had come to realize. "It's always been about the money for them. I hear them talking sometimes. They talk about your estate like it's a business they're waiting to take over." Her validation was a gift, a confirmation that I was not crazy, that I had not imagined the years of subtle and not so subtle greed. I, in turn, explained my reasons, not out of a need to justify myself, but because I owed her the truth. I spoke of feeling invisible, of feeling like a utility rather than a person. I told her about the endless stream of requests, the lack of thanks, and the profound loneliness that came from being loved, not for who I was, but for what I had. Chloe listened patiently, her quiet affirmations of "I know," and "I've seen it" punctuating my story. She shared her own quiet observations, her own discomfort with her parents' relentless pursuit of status and material possessions. "They were mad because you bought yourself a ticket to the symphony last week," she revealed quietly. "I heard them. Mom said you were being frivolous with their inheritance." That single, stunning revelation solidified the rightness of my actions more than any legal document ever could. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so deeply ingrained, that they couldn't even see it themselves. My conversation with Chloe that day was a turning point. It was the construction of a bridge across a generational divide, a connection forged in honesty and mutual respect. I made it clear to her that my actions were not aimed at her, and I explained the trust fund I had set up for her future, a tool for her own independence. This heartfelt conversation showed me that, while I may have lost a son, I had solidified a bond with my granddaughter, a healthier, more genuine connection that offered a hopeful, shining contrast to the toxic wasteland of my relationship with Mark and Sarah. The consequences of my preemptive strike were not theoretical. They were immediate, tangible, and for Mark and Sarah, devastatingly real. The first domino to fall was the automatic mortgage payment for their house. When the first of the month arrived, the transfer simply didn't happen. The same was true for Sarah's luxury car lease, the private school tuition, and the generous monthly stipend they had come to view not as a gift but as a salary. The abrupt cessation of these funds was like turning off the water supply to a lavish, water-guzzling fountain. The beautiful display immediately began to sputter and die. Within 2 weeks, the bank sent them the first formal notice of a missed mortgage payment, a cold, official letter that reality had arrived in their mailbox. The leasing company for Sarah's car was less patient, with phone calls that quickly escalated from polite reminders to firm demands. The barrage of calls and messages to my phone began almost immediately. The initial tone was one of angry disbelief. "Mom, the mortgage payment didn't go through. You need to fix this now," Mark demanded in a voicemail, his voice tight with panic. There was no apology, no softening of his tone, just the same old entitled expectation that I would clean up the mess. I listened to the message and then calmly deleted it. I did not reply. I had drawn a line in the sand, and I would not allow myself to be pulled back over it. As the days turned into weeks, the tone of their messages began to shift, a desperate dance between anger and manipulation. Sarah sent long, rambling text messages, alternating between accusing me of trying to make them homeless and reminiscing about happier times, a transparent attempt to guilt me into submission. They were messages written by a stranger, because the woman she was trying to manipulate no longer existed. The financial scramble became a frantic, full-blown crisis for them. They had built a life on a foundation of my money, and without it, their entire structure was collapsing. The private school sent a notice that my grandchildren would be disenrolled if the outstanding tuition balance wasn't paid. I later learned from Chloe that Sarah had to endure the profound humiliation of going to the headmaster and arranging a payment plan, something she likely never imagined she would have to do. The expensive car was repossessed from their driveway one quiet Tuesday morning, a public spectacle for all their discerning neighbors to witness. They were forced to put their sprawling house on the market, as there was no conceivable way for them to afford the mortgage payments on Mark's modest salary alone. The lifestyle they had so carefully curated, the one designed to project an image of effortless wealth, was crumbling into dust, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Throughout this period, my friend Brenda was my rock. I would read her the desperate, manipulative texts from Sarah, and she would respond with a snort of derisive laughter. "Oh, now she remembers that time you took her to the beach when she was 10, Brenda would say. "Funny how she forgot that when she was demanding you pay for her trip to the Cayman Islands last year." Her unwavering support was the anchor that kept me steady. She validated my decision at every turn, reminding me that what I was doing was not cruel, but necessary. "You gave them a 20-year head start, Eleanor," she told me over tea one afternoon. "If they can't stand on their own 2 feet after all that, then it's high time they learned how." Her friendship was a fortress of its own, a safe harbor, where my resolve was not questioned but celebrated. While Mark and Sarah flailed in the financial mess of their own making, their angry, pleading messages becoming just pathetic background noise, I stood firm. I was not their solution anymore. I was simply a spectator to their long overdue lesson in consequences. As the dust from the explosions settled, a new and unfamiliar sensation began to permeate my days. A profound sense of peace. The phone still rang occasionally with a number I recognized as Mark's or Sarah's, but I no longer felt a jolt of anxiety. I would simply let it ring, the sound a distant echo from a life I no longer lived. My newfound financial security wasn't just about the numbers in my bank account, it was about the reclamation of my time, my energy, and my right to choose. For the first time in decades, my decisions were dictated not by the needs and wants of others, but by my own quiet desires. The freedom was intoxicating. I began to invest in myself, pouring resources into the fallow ground of my own long-deferred dreams. The first thing I did was hire a landscape architect to redesign my garden, a passion I had neglected while funding Sarah's ever-changing interior design whims. I spent blissful afternoons planning flower beds, choosing ornamental trees, and designing a small stone patio with a water feature. The act of cultivating beauty for my own enjoyment felt like a radical act of self-care. Next, I enrolled in a pottery class at the local community college, something I had wanted to do since my 20s. The feeling of the cool, wet clay spinning beneath my hands was grounding, a tangible connection to the act of creation. My first few pots were wobbly and misshapen, but I loved them. They were mine. They were imperfect and beautiful, much like my own life. I also began to redecorate my home, not for resale value but for my own comfort and joy. The sensible, muted colors I had always lived with were replaced with warm, vibrant hues. I bought a ridiculously comfortable armchair in a bright, cheerful yellow and placed it in the sunniest corner of my living room. I filled the walls with art from local artists, pieces that spoke to me, not to a particular design trend. My house, once just a quiet place to exist, began to feel like a true sanctuary, a reflection of the woman I was becoming. Brief updates on Mark and Sarah's situation would filter through to me, mostly via Chloe. They had sold their large house and moved into a much smaller rental in a less prestigious town an hour away. Mark was forced to take on a second job in the evenings to make ends meet, and Sarah, for the first time in her adult life, was looking for employment. Chloe told me they were constantly stressed and argued frequently, but they were, slowly and painfully, learning to manage their own lives. They were learning to stand on their own feet. Navigating the new family dynamic required a delicate touch. I maintained my firm financial boundaries without exception. When Chloe's birthday came around, I sent her a thoughtful gift, but I did not send the large check her parents had likely been hoping for. I made it clear that my relationship with her was separate from my relationship, or lack thereof, with them. We established a routine of weekly phone calls and monthly lunches, just the two of us. Our conversations were open and honest, filled with the genuine affection that had been so absent from my interactions with her parents. I was building a new kind of family, one based not on obligation or transaction, but on a foundation of mutual respect and love. My life was smaller in some ways, quieter, but it was also infinitely richer and more authentic than it had ever been before. I was finally, truly, living for myself. The ultimate celebration of my reclaimed life was a trip I had dreamed of for 50 years. My late husband, David, and I had always planned to see the national parks of the American West, but life, and then raising Mark, had always gotten in the way. After he was gone, the dream felt too large, too lonely to pursue on my own. But now, with my friend Brenda as my enthusiastic co-pilot, the dream was reborn. We spent 3 glorious weeks on the road, a pair of septuagenarians in a comfortable rental car with an impeccable playlist and no agenda other than our own delight. We stood in awe at the edge of the Grand Canyon in Arizona, the sheer scale of it putting all my past family dramas into their proper, insignificant perspective. We watched the sunset paint the hoodoos of Bryce Canyon in fiery shades of orange and pink, and we felt a sense of profound spiritual peace. During that trip, Brenda and I talked for hours as the vast, beautiful landscapes of Utah and Colorado rolled past our windows. We talked about our lives, our joys, our regrets, and the strange, unexpected turns a life can take. "Do you ever feel guilty?" she asked me one evening as we sat on the porch of a cabin, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. I considered her question carefully. "I feel sad that it came to this," I admitted honestly. "I feel sad for the relationship with my son that I thought I had, or at least hoped I could have. But guilty? No. The guilt had been burned away, cauterized by the stark clarity of their actions at that final dinner. I have nothing to feel guilty for. I gave him everything, and it still wasn't enough. The only thing I did wrong was wait so long to stop." My final reflections on this long, arduous journey crystallized under that vast, starry sky. Family, I realized, is not just about blood. It is about respect, reciprocity, and love that is not conditional on financial gain. I had learned the hard way that you cannot buy genuine affection, and that enabling bad behavior is not a form of love, but a form of harm, both to them and to yourself. Acknowledging the deep pain of the past, the years of feeling used and undervalued, was a necessary step, but I refused to live there. I had to break with that past to build a future. The profound, undeniable importance of self-worth and self-preservation was the greatest lesson of my life. I had finally learned to be the protagonist of my own story, not a supporting character in someone else's. When I returned home, tanned, happy, and filled with a sense of unshakable contentment, a deep and lasting peace had settled over me for good. My home was my sanctuary, my friendships were my strength, and my relationship with Chloe was a source of pure joy. My life was my own, lived entirely on my own terms. I was stronger, wiser, and more genuinely content than I had ever been. The silence from Mark and Sarah was no longer a weight but a relief. My journey had been a difficult one, a painful navigation through the complex currents of family duty and personal betrayal. But it had brought me here, to this shore of serene liberation, and for that, I was eternally grateful. The rest of my life stretched before me, not as a slow decline into old age, but as a grand, open adventure that I was finally free to write myself.